Hi y'all, welcome to the channel. My name is Daniel and this is my wife Shay. On this channel we discuss things related to theology, philosophy, and things related to the modern world. So we are not Christians, although it may sound like that sometimes. We're on the journey seeking truth, and that has led us to changing where we live, to a lot of life changes, just again seeking the truth. So I'm not just coming down on one side or the other here. It may sound like I contradict myself in my videos, but I'm not just coming down on one side or the other because I happen to be born into this religion, I have a Christian background, or for emotional reasons or anything like this. I'm just seeking the truth, and things are very nuanced, right? So it does seem like I contradict myself sometimes potentially, but if you look into what I'm actually saying, I'm just weighing both sides. I'm looking at both sides and trying to come to the truth. So Shay and I were just having a discussion and decided to record it. So we were talking about, so my previous video where I was talking about nature, and we were talking about, I think we touched on paganism a bit of sympathy for paganism, not the evil parts of it, but that there was some good in it, particularly the philosophers, the virtuous pagans that came from paganism. And we were discussing how Christian civilization really improved these previous ancient civilizations and was really a good and beautiful civilization, the traditional Christian civilization during the medieval era, which again, you have a lot of secular brainwashing going on where they call it the Dark Ages and everything was so bad, and it really wasn't. And there were a lot of good things that came from Christian civilization in the West, but elsewhere as well. But I'm not talking about modern Western civilization. Modern Western civilization represents the overthrowing of Christianity. It does not represent Christian civilization. I'm talking traditional Christian civilization, not liberalism. Liberalism overthrew Christianity. But we were talking about a lot of things. I mean, a lot of disgusting, terrible things were going on in the pagan world. We were talking about the Old Testament as well. People criticize the Old Testament for being harsh, like with the slave example. Yes, there are slaves in the Old Testament, and there are slaves in the New Testament as well. The Church Fathers don't condemn slavery, but that's another subject. But yes, slavery is present in the Old Testament. But in the ancient world, people were relatively very harsh with their slaves, and there wasn't laws protecting them to the extent that you have in the Old Testament necessarily. Where a master, if he maims his slave in any way, takes out an eye or something like this, then the slave is to be freed. If he's a slave, he's to be punished. If the slave escapes, he's not to be brought back to the master. The slavery was slavery. It's not our modern conception of slavery, like going back to the 1800s, the Civil War, enslaving Africans. It wasn't like that. These people put themselves into slavery. From my understanding, they were basically indentured servants and became part of the family. And part of that was physical discipline. Just like the father has the authority to physically discipline his children, the man of the household had the authority to physically discipline his slaves. And that's just that. But the Old Testament law is relatively much better compared to what was going on in pagan civilizations. And you had a lot of terrible things going on in pagan civilizations. Even talking about the best, right? Ancient Greece, you had Pederasty, which for those who don't know, in ancient Greece you had grown men who would take boys under their wing and learn from them in exchange for pleasure. Teenage boys.
Sorry to interrupt. Isn't that similar to Bachabazi that was taking place in Afghanistan?
Right.
Okay.
Which, from my understanding, the people that took over Afghanistan have banned Bachabazi, but I won't get too much into that right now. But in ancient Greece, you had this common cultural practice, though it seems like men like Plato were against it. So it's not like everybody was doing this and it was just all cool. No, people did have a problem with it. It's just that it was a common cultural practice. So you had these kinds of things. You had, in ancient Rome, you had the Roman baths where there was a lot of degeneracy going on. You had a lot of things going on where it was common in the ancient world to kill your children for population control, exposure, things like this. And you had the gladiator games in the Roman Empire. There were many degenerate things that basically when Christians took over, they shut down quickly. Again, paganism is not one monolithic thing, right? You have decent pagans and you have degenerate pagans. Now that doesn't justify maybe the worship of false gods, but you did have pagans who are relatively moral, and I'll explain that. So you had a lot of in the ancient world in paganism. You had human sacrifice from ancient Canaan, where the children of Israel took over. They kicked the tribes out of Canaan. You had a lot of degenerate practices going there involving consecrating children to demons, burning children alive, these kinds of things. And you had the Aztecs who sacrificed thousands of people a year. And human sacrifice is a pretty common thing you see in the ancient world. You had a lot of degenerate practices amongst Indo-European paganism, all the way from India to Scandinavian pagans, where they engaged in, it typically involved a horse, but I'll just say bestiality in a sort of religious ritual. These kinds of degenerate practices were very common, but the church shut them down. Now, as far as the decent pagans I was talking about, you have Plato, who, Socrates, who Socrates and Plato. Plato writes the words of Socrates. So Socrates' thought and Plato's thought are basically the same. But anyway, Socrates was on trial for basically blasphemy and for criticizing their religion. In Plato's Republic, you see that Socrates, and in other works, you see that Socrates was condemning the myths of the pagans because they portrayed the gods as evil and just degenerate. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the myths with all the ancient Greek gods where they do degenerate things to each other and to everybody else. Incest, rape, bestiality, same stuff, murder, stuff you see in Hinduism to this day, in Hindu myths. So you had these things, but Plato condemned these and said that we need new stories to teach the people because the gods are perfectly good and they act on virtue, and we want the people to emulate them by being virtuous. And Plato also believed in a singular, supreme one that is perfectly good. Right, so there was some quasi-monotheism going on with Plato, with Aristotle, with the Stoics as well. So Plato advocated getting rid of degeneracy within paganism and replacing it with a more purified version of paganism. Now that said, when Christianity took over, what did they do? They destroyed the pagan temples because they believed the gods were demons, which is often why Christians were being persecuted in the early centuries, not because they were so nice and tolerant. They were being persecuted because they were quite aggressive in their anti-paganism, where they would destroy pagan statues, pagan temples were destroyed. They would be quite disrespectful to pagan gods because they believed that they were demons, and they would reject any sacrifice to them or any participation in their rituals. So really early Christianity was very much against paganism, not pagan, not like adopting a quasi-paganism. So when Christianity took over and became the state religion, then a lot of good things started to happen. You had the toleration of Christians, and then over time you had the destruction of what they saw as demonic idols and demonic temples and churches built on top of them, on top of these temples, or they would just turn the temples into churches. You had the shutting down of the Roman baths, where there were a lot of degeneracy. There was a lot of degeneracy going on in the Roman baths, at least in the later parts of the empire, I believe. Stuff going on because it was co-ed, mixed gender, public baths. And things such as shutting down the gladiator games, where people would sit in a big stadium and basically watch people kill each other brutally, or watch animals kill people. So these kinds of things were shut down by the church. It's shut down by the pagan civilization that took over. And then from there you had the blossoming of a Christian civilization that was basically a purified version of, I was just talking to her, almost a purified, baptized version of Plato's Republic. You had literal saint kings who were, by all accounts, very wise men, merciful, but also just, very charitable, who stood up for what is right and lived righteous, holy lives like you would see the philosopher kings do in Plato's Republic. You have the guardian class, basically, where you had a warrior class of spiritual and religious men who were also, right, a warrior class where the men were also spiritual and religious, who would take vows of poverty, who had all things in common. If you're familiar with Plato's Republic, you'll know what I'm referring to. If not, then just take my word for it. So the guardian class, right, men who would take vows of poverty, who would have all things in common, who wouldn't be focused on material wealth, but who would be focused on fighting for what's right, at least from their perspective. This doesn't mean everything in Christian civilization was perfect, but you still had basically a class of warrior monks and spiritual men who fought for religious and spiritual reasons. You had a hierarchy, right? Also, these men didn't. In Plato's Republic, you have these philosophical warriors having a community of wives. They would share wives so that they could reproduce with the best and create the best offspring. In Christianity, you obviously didn't have this. These men took vows of, or at least the military religious orders took vows of chastity. But you had a hierarchical society which was overthrown and overturned by the Satanic French Revolution and liberalism that came and overturned the Western world, where now we replace the traditional hierarchy with liberal democracy. But you had many other things too. You had the blossoming of higher education. You had them reviving the good that was present in Greek philosophy, like Aristotle with the scholastics. The building of hospitals, which to this day, religious orders, that I was born in a Catholic hospital run by nuns and priests. The blossoming of hospitals, of universities run by the church. The church was very much involved with science and scientific discovery, and they encouraged it. This went downhill towards the modern era where they were coming out with discoveries that conflicted with the church's understanding of things, but that's another subject. I don't even want to say coming out with discoveries, coming out with theories that conflicted with the church's understanding of things and presenting it as though their ideas were against the church. They created a conflict of science and theology that was not previously there. So you had the church, the Catholic Church, really doing a lot of good things for civilization, and you had a good, relatively, compared to nowadays, moral civilization, and that purified the degeneracy of pagan civilization. This is why, if we want to talk about the Portuguese and the Spanish conquering the New World, a lot of Muslims will criticize this, and they'll tend to take the side of the natives. But if you look at how Islam spread, and you look at what a lot of these natives were doing prior to the coming of Christianity, the Christian conquerors of the New World were more or less, they weren't perfect, but they were better than what was here before. The Spanish didn't engage in ritual cannibalism and the mass sacrificing of thousands of people a year like the Aztecs did. They destroyed that civilization and they replaced it with Christianity, something much better. So you had a lot of good things coming from this Christian civilization.
So Daniel and I were talking about how the other day we went to the traditional Latin Mass, and he said, "Oh, do you know what the name of that church was?" I was like, "No." And then he told me it was the Lady of Lourdes?
Our Lady of Lourdes. Yeah.
Our Lourdes? Like
Lourdes. Lourdes.
Okay, so it's Our Lady of Lourdes, and he says, "You know what the hospital's name is that I was born in?" And it turned out that it was the hospital, the name of the hospital was Our Lady of Lourdes. And then I was like, "Oh, so it was Catholic. Was it run by nuns?" And he said, "Yeah, actually it was." Right? And I was like, well, there you go, like you need to have nuns as the nurses and doctors, because then that allows the laymen, the lay women and men in the civilizations to focus on their families and not force the women into these positions where most of their energy is going into focusing on the patients. Mm-hmm. Of course, you need doctors and nurses. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have that, but it's who fills that role, right? And so this is perfect, because then this gives the laymen and the women the opportunity to focus on their families, right? Because that's their role, right? So this is when we kind of started going to the conversation of how you said, well, Christianity actually did a lot for the world.
Yeah, building hospitals, colleges. I mean, the colleges used to be religious centers of learning, really. They were founded by religious men. Even the newer ones in the West, a lot of them were founded by religious men, particularly Protestants, but still,
Yeah, that's a perfect model. And I was like, oh, it kind of sounds like, when he talks about the traditional Catholic world in the past, it kind of sounds like a baptized version of Plato's Republic. It's virtuous, it's serving the higher purpose, which is God, and everyone has their own roles.
And it's a better myth. And I don't mean myth in the bad way. Myth in the way I'm using it is not as a fake story. It's a true story that conveys higher truth. That's what I mean by myth. So the story of Christ is a much better, this is what I was getting at with Plato, right? He wanted these degenerate myths of the gods to be replaced by a better one. Well, it was. The story of Christ, even if you don't believe in it, is much better than all these other stories of the ancient gods, right? And that's more conducive to a good, virtuous civilization, which is, again, wasn't perfect, and there's a lot of lies about Christian civilization from the medieval era, but it was better than what was going on before in many ways.
Right. Yeah.
Architecture too. I mean, the beautiful architecture. Everybody loves the churches. Everybody loves going. Even if you're a Muslim or an atheist, you love the beautiful Gothic cathedrals and stuff. You know what I mean? I know. Which comes from an understanding of beauty, which gets into spiritual things, because beauty is a transcendent principle. Right. But.
I've seen so many Muslim women, and when we would go to certain churches, especially in Ottawa, them just taking videos and stuff, and I was like, there you have it. I mean, technically, Islamically speaking, you're not allowed to visit any of these places, right? Because it's forbidden, but it seems like beauty is just calling you and pulling you towards it. It's beckoning you, and you can't deny it. And same thing with atheists. Like I've known a particular atheist who love these Gothic cathedrals, but this person would say some terrible things about God, and it's like, you're such a hypocrite. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Which, again, it's often thought that the modern era, post-1700s, is Christian civilization. It's not. It is the deliberate satanic overthrowing of what was Christian. That is what it is. So this goes even to art. This is what I'm talking about. You have this beautiful architecture which raises your energy and directs your thoughts to transcendent principles, whereas certain agencies in the modern world, particularly in the United States, have deliberately supported modern art, ugly art, and this just, it's either disgusting and just degenerate, or it's degenerate in a less obvious sense, in that all your cities are just gray concrete buildings meant for making money. There's nothing beautiful about it. There's nothing really good or wholesome about it. And so they replaced the beautiful architecture with this new gray, ugly concrete bunkers with windows, basically. And what goes on inside, just consumerism, right? I mean, that's all there is to this modern society. And that's the elevation, the flipping of the hierarchy, right? Now spirituality is in the bottom. It's your personal thing. It's whatever you want to, that's okay for you. This is okay for everybody else. Just keep your faith to yourself. Don't let it impact the public sphere. But then we raise the material over the spiritual, and this is the flipping of the hierarchy, and the material over the spiritual with ultimately the individual at the top. You do what you want. You become your own God, which is Satan's original lie in the garden.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I also wanted to go back to one of the points you made. I think this is probably new research. So this is basically what we share, is the knowledge that Daniel accrues on this journey, and then we share it and then give our thoughts on it, which is, it's a journey. It's not going to be like a sprint. And so, Daniel, I think you were talking about how in the pagan world, they were treating the slaves really badly, which was one of the concerns that I brought up with the Old Testament in the Bible. Well, it wasn't on camera. It was when we were just talking about, I showed you this comment that someone made, and it was just, I think they're trying to paint this particular part in the Bible as a really, they're trying to mislead people with it, which is if you're, something about your slave dying if you beat it up or something like that. Anyway, so that was...
If you beat him up.
If you beat him up. Or...
if you beat him up.
I don't know. But yeah, so it didn't sit right with me when it came to the slavery stuff. But then now what you told me...
It sounds pretty bad when you don't have the context, right?
Yeah. So, and I think that's the thing with with the other concerns that I have of the Old Testament. I'm sure there's a good answer to it, probably. I think you just need to do some digging for me, please.
Yeah, I mean,
he looks into this stuff. I'm focused on house chores. I give you my concerns, you go research, and then you...
Yeah, one of the biggest, and we were talking about this morning, and we talk about it frequently, really. We were talking about the whole genocide issue in the Old Testament, where God has the children of Israel wipe out every man, woman, child, and animal of particular tribes. It's not the default when they go to war. God lays down with the default laws of war, and I believe in Deuteronomy chapter 24, and it's not wholesale genocide. But there were a couple particular tribes God said this needs to happen to. Now, this is obviously controversial. If you believe in objective morality, then it can seem counterintuitive to justify children, obviously. Now, there are things going on, though, in the context that are possible answers to this, however, right? Again, these civilizations, these cultures, these particular tribes were extremely degenerate. It says in the book of Exodus that God gave them a certain amount of time, I think it was hundreds of years, to get over their degeneracy, and now that their time was up, and God said that they're going to be destroyed.
Sounds like America right now.
Yeah, which gets to what a particular priest was saying, which this priest actually said that according to certain visions from Our Lady of Medjugorje, is that this current generation is the most evil in human history, worse than the flood, worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. But anyway, back to my original point. This priest also said that this got my mind going and how it relates to this. You'll see in a minute. This priest was talking about how Satanists will consecrate a child to Satan, either a baby or a young child, and that child will then be consecrated to Satan and be potentially possessed or be dealing with demons for the rest of its life. So this consecration involves a consecration. You're setting aside this child, devoting it to Satan, and it usually involves a ritual of some kind on the child. Now, this stuff was going on in the ancient world with these ancient civilizations that the Israelites were told to wipe out. Again, there were particular tribes in particular circumstances they were told to destroy, and when they didn't apparently destroy this one, King Saul was told to destroy everybody. He didn't, and from my understanding, from what I've heard, I don't really remember exactly where this is at in the Bible, but he didn't get rid of the children. Those children grew up later to cause problems for the children of Israel. So one, we have God's foreknowledge, and two, we have the fact that These people literally consecrated their children to Satan. They would, from what I've read, they would use their demonic idols for rituals. They would consecrate homes by burying their children underneath the foundation. Just a sick society that would do these kinds of things. And it's the children themselves were apparently demon-possessed. Now, you didn't have exorcism in the Old Testament. So you had a society that was so possessed, again, even animals can become possessed. So if you had such a society, God says to wipe it out completely. Okay, well, this is some useful background information for why God would command such a thing, right?
Sure.
Again, I haven't made a decision on this in particular. In this particular issue, I haven't made a decision on, but this is a possible response to this, is that basically the society was so bad, even the children were demonic, so they were told to get rid of them, right? And again, God has foreknowledge in regards to what will happen if you don't get rid of them.
What would be the response to God demanding the killing of animals too? Was there bestiality going on too?
I would imagine there was. I think there was bestiality going on, but again, animals can also become demonically possessed.
Okay.
So, well, that's a perfect image right there. Compare Christian civilization or Old Testament law to that stuff, you see which one's better, right? And I think everybody agrees that Christian civilization, compared to these other ones, or at least they can agree that it was superior, even if you're an atheist or a Muslim, right? And there's a lot of great things about Islamic civilization too, but I'm just talking about Christian civilization right now. So.
Okay, sounds good. The Muslims are gonna hate me. They're like, she has so much bias towards, I guess, Christianity. But if you look at the Ottoman Empire, I mean, things weren't, according to what I know and what you know, things weren't strictly Islamic either. I mean, this is probably why I got overthrown by the Wahhabis, because they were apparently not the proper Muslims.
We can get into that really quickly. So,
do you want to get into that in another video, if that's okay? Because it's already pushing 30 minutes.
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks, love.
Attention spans are short, and the camera cuts out at 30 minutes. So.
Yeah, and we're pretty short in budget for editing softwares and stuff, so I've got to keep the video short. Otherwise, my phone is going to blow up if I have like a 40-minute video that I have to edit, unfortunately. So anyways, guys, we hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to give it a like, share, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what your thoughts are. And God willing, we'll see you guys next time. Take care. Bye. Peace.